Let's see
There
the
you go.
translation from
Yes.
UK.
Yes,
Yes, good. We would say good evening, but it's obviously good morning in the UK right now, right?
yes.
Absolutely. Nice and rainy morning here. How are you guys doing? You keeping well?
Keeping very, very
We're
well.
good. It's also rainy here,
Yeah,
although it's been
exactly.
pretty
So it looks
wet
like,
the entire day.
yeah,
But nonetheless, it's a borderless e-conference, and therefore, no matter where we are in the world, it's amazing to be able to connect to you and discuss, I guess, an issue that's quite interesting to people like us in the broadcasting
that's right.
scene as well, looking at greener broadcasting and in times of uncertainty to look at the media supply chain and assets as well. To the both of you, James and Francisco, take it away.
Cool.
Let's
Thank you,
start,
guys.
James, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first things you touched on there, which I think was quite key, was the supply chain. I mean, for me, foremost, if you don't work in our industry, the consumption of media is like turning on a light switch. You turn on Netflix, you turn on Prime, and you just consume, and it's just there. There's no real thought put into that supply chain. Everything from, like you say, the pre-production, all the way through to obviously production and distribution, and all the elements that are required therein. And we have only in our recent history when we had flooding and other events, which had a huge impact into the physical supply chain of even media. I'm sure, as you remember, Francisco, the shortage of LTO tapes that we had only a few years ago, and other tape formats that we had, and that's something where it really took everybody by surprise. The inability to just pick up a tape or a piece of equipment which was just so readily available and never even hit anybody as a mindset that I wouldn't be able to go buy this consumable tomorrow. And I think that's just a real example of how fragile our media supply chain genuinely can be. And of course, today we're all working from remote locations, as we're all handling, as you say, the new normal in this industry. And I think that came as a shock as well. And I think really just highlights the need for us to, I think a key word I like to think of, Francisco, is flex. Within our organizations, within the media space, we have, as you know, very high SLAs, very quick turnaround times, and often the need to be green and be conscious of our footprint and our impact on the environment kind of goes out the window when it comes to getting it done quickly or getting it done. That's the priority, and necessarily having the right green credentials doesn't always go with that. I think what we need to look at now is that we are really entering a time where nobody predicted COVID and the impact of COVID to the supply chains. I mean, it shut down all of our production. It shut down our ability to just process content in the supply chain. But it's ironically driven an increase in consumption, because a lot of people now find themselves, instead of being gainfully employed, they find themselves now gainfully idle and have a need to consume media. So we have this real juxtaposition in the industry now where content consumption has increased, whereas the ability to produce content has dropped. And I think if we step back into, like I say, recent events where the environment has impacted our supply chains, it really, all of this, the message that's coming out of this is that ability to handle uncertainty, to handle crisis, and to be able to do that in a way where fundamentally you're not going to be able to predict the future of wwhat's happening. And really, that's, I think, what the focus, certainly what Altana Media Group's about. And obviously, I know a lot, Francisco, I'll let you talk on Object Matrix, but a key part of what we like to try and do is ensure that the workflows that we deploy are able to be deployed and redeployed and reconfigured, and have that control and transparency that you need across the entire supply chain to be able to very quickly handle rapid change. I mean, do you have any points on your side, Francisco, from an object matrix
Yeah.
perspective, about the kind of flexibility there?
Yes, no, I completely agree. I mean, we had multiple events that affected the supply chain, and we have to react and make people realize that the environment is something that is there, and every person, but importantly every company, needs to address. It's simple it's easy to avoid the question, oh, what can I do? What can my company do? But we all can do something. And we at OM, we passionately believe that being a company that runs in our own house in a green fashion. For instance, we hold company policies to the non-usage of single-use plastics wherever we can. along with other aspects that we'll discuss in this webinar. The media industry can do a lot in this area, and it's interesting to read. For example, there was a paper from the BBC's environmental sustainability to get greener broadcasting guidelines. It's very interesting, and to see how we can do much better, but as people, but also companies can do a lot to be greener.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's interesting if you take the analogy of broadcasting not even 10 years ago, I guess, where the main form of distribution to home was, of course, the transmitter, whether it be digital transmission or analog transmission, or even, I guess, satellite. And one of the shifts that obviously IP distribution, particularly cloud-based distribution, has brought is, of course, that the footprint, the carbon footprint of the distribution now is significantly higher than what it used to be. And so it's just little things like that where we're all moving to the cloud. It's the way to go. But by not being able to understand what cloud you're in and the footprint of that cloud, how do you make that sustainable choice? How do you know who's the best choice to go with? And I understand that Matrix Store has just launched its own cloud, which, I mean, presumably if I wanted to, I could quantify and understand the carbon footprint of the usage of the Matrix Store cloud if that's something I wanted to. Is that right, Francisco?
Yeah. We can. Something we do is to measure the footprints of the systems that we deploy and that we recommend. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So yes. Sorry, Francisco, please.
No. Yes. Go on.
So I think one of the things I could say is that by introducing Flex, we have to be careful that we don't introduce this disregard, as you say, for the environment. Often the quickest route from A to B, when you're having to make an imperfect decision, which so many companies have had to do in light of COVID, can lead to a situation where you end up putting in a solution which potentially isn't quite as environmentally friendly or environmentally responsible as what you would have done given a little bit more time. But I also think it's an opportunity for change. We have many customers around the world who we've been talking to for many years, and for those who are watching who aren't familiar with what Altana Media Group does, we specialize in orchestration. So orchestration, of course, as the word says, is that to try and drive business processes with a minimum amount of human effort. And yes, one part of that is to try and ensure that we have an efficiency when it comes to human resources and physical resources. But also, it's one thing about transparency. One of the biggest things that the benefit you get from orchestration that people often don't realize in the first pass is that ability to see in real time where something's happening, because you're no longer dependent upon a human being in reporting that information back. And really, as long as you have an orchestration system that is very well integrated, and as you know, Francisco, we have a deep integration with both Object Matrix's Vision platform, but also the Matrix Store Cloud. It allows us to leverage that orchestration to, obviously in turn have actions within Matrix Store or other devices in that overarching supply chain. And the benefit of Cubics being very tightly integrated, but also being very configurable and critically reconfigurable, that's the key word, is that when a situation occurs, whether it be an environmental event, or whether it be COVID or anything like this, where flex is needed in the supply chain, that ability to adapt to change, the shockwave of change, our clients have done very well. But what we found interesting is that clients we spoke to a few years ago, where we were discussing these topics of orchestration and the benefits, who clients who didn't place value upon that, now following COVID and more this focus on, I mean, we only have to look in Los Angeles these last few weeks, and Washington State, and all of the Washington County, sorry, all the fires that we've seen. I think anybody who can still today say that the environmental impact we're having on this planet is imaginary or non-existent is slightly to be questioned. It's something that we have to be dealing with today, and this recent shell shock we've had to face in the supply chain when it comes to learning a new normal, whether it be from remote working or social distancing, whatever it may be, it also is a great inflection point. It's a real opportunity to adapt to technologies that allow us to ensure that green protection. And I think the most clean example for me is, we are considering effectively closing our office entirely because we found that all of our staff can work remotely without any need to transfer to the office. And of course, that creates a huge significant reduction in our carbon footprint as a business. Working with partners like yourselves who are also very environmentally friendly, again, it allows us to advise clients on how they can adopt technologies into their workflow, which again help reduce that footprint. And it can be done in a nice step change. So for example, if I had a client who was currently using S3 or some quite old technology where the power footprint was quite poor, we can provide them a solution where we can do that, that step change point by point, to allow us to remove those elements of the supply chain where it's not ideal when it comes to the environmental friendly footprint. So I think for me, in summary, right now, it's an opportunity where people should really look to their supply chains, and they're hidden away, as the introduction was done. If you don't work in media, when you click play on Netflix or you click play on Amazon Prime, you don't think about the whole supply chain of QC, of everything that you and I, Francisco, know very well, the huge amounts of effort. In the very same way, I don't work in the power distribution department. Therefore, when I turn on my light switch, I'm not thinking about the guys in the power station and the guys doing all of that. So I think it's there's a natural naivety as human beings we have where we just consume something, don't really put too much thought into how it's been created, and in turn that makes us kind of guilty in the sense of, I would never ask myself, or haven't, and maybe we should more, what was the carbon footprint of this episode on Netflix? What is that impact of me actually consuming it? Do I be responsible in my viewing choices to do that? And I think that's something that will come over time as people become more acutely aware of the impact of. When it comes to clouds, we talk about clouds. Do you have? You may know better than I, Francisco, but the footprint, the power footprint right now that is being drawn, and it must be 4, 6, 8, 10% of the global power demand being consumed by Amazon and Microsoft.
Yeah.
There must be a crazy number. I'm not sure what it is, but would you agree it's quite a?
We don't know. It's hidden. Yes.
Yeah, and that's the point. It's hidden. So and there's a big desire to move to the cloud, because of the efficiency it gives you. Well, yes, but not all clouds are born equal. As you say, Matrix Cloud is obviously a good example of that. And I think using technology in a way where, coming back to a point of orchestration and transparency, it's something that we encourage clients to do more, but not only look at their workflow and supply chain from a, how much am I charging for this unit? How much am I, how long is it taking? But also, what is my carbon footprint? How long, am I making the right choices? And so from a workflow efficiency perspective, it gives you that granularity and control to not only assess performance and assess KPIs and everything, but also bringing that assessment of environmental impact. And I think that's a key change I'd like to see a lot more in the industry adopt towards.
Yeah, flex is key, but so be able to adapt and react. But there is also another one of the key points that the BBC guidelines is, for example, that it's important in order to be able to alter behaviors or realize outcomes of how is the media the supply chain is to start measuring. You need to measure and monitor, and this is key as well. It's very important to be able to change and to alter behaviors. So this is one of the things we are looking constantly is how, for example, how green our nodes are. So we deploy storage, we sell storage as an appliance, but as a service. But all we measure how green our nodes are because we want to know, and it's very interesting in how. And the last years, the power consumption has progressed in the hardware itself. For example, a few years back, a 1 terabyte disk was consuming 8 watts, which is not so bad because 15 drives in an array would be the equivalent of an old 120 watts light bulb. But now we're using disks with 20 terabyte capacity that they consume about 7 watts, which is and a lot less when it's idle. So the improvement doesn't look big a lot compared 8 watts compared to 7, but the thing is that that disk is now storing 20 terabytes instead of 1. So we get like 23 times less power per wattage, and so 1 petabyte these days can be held in the equivalent of 3 old light bulbs, and a lot less when it's idle. So sometimes replacing your old gasoline smokes spewing old car, it's appropriate, and you should look at IT in the same way. The IT that you consume, the IT that you use, or the IT that you provide and you supply. So we constantly look at these things. For example, also SSDs. SSDs are more like 200 times 200% more efficient than hard drives. So we try to use them as much as we can. So there are different aspects that you should be aware, and the best ways to measure, to monitor, see what's is the only way you can progress, is to know exactly what's the current situation at the moment.
And it's exactly that. It's back to that point of transparency, is that, you know, like you say, the only way you can do this is, first off, is to measure where you are today, to then identify that step goal for improvement. And that sounds simple. I mean, we talked about, like you say, we can take a hard drive, we know how much it's, you know, how much power it's consuming, but be able to put that then in context of a supply chain with, as you know, we have the compliance, the editing, the review and approve, the grading, and everything that goes into that supply chain. It can be quite difficult, especially when working across multiple parties. You know, it's obviously quite common that an asset would be, you know, filmed by one company, obviously QC and complied by another, and obviously then distributed by one or the others in the chain. So it's actually quite an interesting point that absolutely there are technology benefits that people like Matrix Store and Object Matrix bring, and being very focused on that efficiency. But it's another to be able to identify where today that you have that, and critically, as we've said, being able to handle uncertainty. So being able to maintain that transparency, you know, should the workflow change. And that's where there's been, as I'm sure you've seen over the years, you know, many attempts of introducing APIs and sort of other common interfaces that allow you know, different customers or different platforms to interact within a supply chain. You know, in the UK, for example, we've only just launched an API for our power grid. So now we have, I'm very pleased to say, you know, people like Tesla using their battery technology and helping actually supply grid on demand, because that API has allowed that real-time interaction with the power grid, you know, to be able to respond and deliver power as needed. And that exact approach has been often attempted and failed, sadly, within the media supply chain, where we've tried to homogenize across a wide range of use cases and said, like, everyone's going to communicate using this protocol to provide that single pane of glass approach across the entire supply chain. And the problem is there hasn't been the impetus, I think, for manufacturers and vendors to adapt. And those, you know, APIs that have been brought in, I think, have always been focused on the more local environment. So in a particular studio, as opposed to taking that abstracted view of an end-to-end supply chain. And people like the DPP continue to try and adopt standards, and I'm certainly, you know, a big fan of trying to find you know, a way through that. But I think, again, there isn't that focus today on the supply chain when it comes to, like you say, the measurement that the BBC has put out, the ability to understand what's going off in that supply chain and be able to then measure yourself and improve yourself. And, you know, a big thing of continuous improvement, where, you know, whenever we build a workflow, one of the key things that we want to have is you know, constant review. A workflow is never static. It's constantly changing. It's constantly being adapted. And that's not necessarily that you have to be buying new hardware all the time. It's just finding more efficient means of using that hardware that we've got in. So I think, yeah, to your point to begin with, absolutely, the first step today that broadcasters need to be doing is you know, measurement. It's control, but it's doing that in a way now with a very disparate architecture. And the danger of using cloud, I'm not saying cloud isn't appropriate. We have many clients using cloud, as I know yourselves do, you know, in the appropriate way. But that's the key point. You're not necessarily putting all the media in the cloud using very expensive disks, both from a you know, commercial perspective, also from a, you know, carbon and energy footprint. You know, finding the most efficient means of distributing that media, and really that's where, you know, that orchestration gives you both the transparency with that, and then you can begin that journey of actually introducing the changes that you want to have in the supply chain. So like you say, finding that old piece of steam that you say equipment, which is causing you to be dragged down. And I think the other thing that we see, which is also to be bared in mind, is I think this becomes more relevant to consumer choice, is convergence. I mean, Francisco, I think you're probably as old as I am or older, but we remember the days where technology was, and to think about a TV channel, you would have a video server, you would have a keyer, a subtitler, a vision mixer. Everything would be separate pieces of equipment, taking up racks, 2, 3, 4 racks just for one linear channel. Well, all that's now is running off a GPU board. Even potentially even on a virtualized server. So this convergence of technology within the supply chain has meant that we've gone from 20 boxes doing it down to one, but also the distance between the company or the individuals who have created the content, curated the content, and those consuming the content has also reduced. And I think this is where what we're going to start finding is as we get closer to consumers, as we get closer to their behaviors. I mean, I remember sitting in with a BBC Worldwide listening to Amazon explain how they choose content that looks good together on the shelf, and this was determining the creative process. What content was going to be made was now being driven by what looked good next to each other on the Amazon interface. And for me, that was just such a game, an eye opener to the difference in the world that we now face. So I think, as we've seen movements about consumers quite rightly using their money to decide where they want to place support for companies, and I think broadcasters will be caught out. Those who have not taken care of their carbon footprint, those who have been aware of their energy footprint, and those who have not been exposed. I mean, I would love to see on Netflix, what is the carbon impact for me watching this show, and to have that information, not from just a case of what's streaming, but how's it made. And for me, it's like going around the supermarket. If I was to go and buy, some meat or whatever, you're looking for the ingredients, you're looking to make sure it's salt or add water and things. And why should VOD platforms be any different? And I think it's become more important as it explodes. As we have an explosion of video, we have an explosion of demand. But actually, what we found recently, there's been, as it's very difficult to produce new content. So we've had to go back to the archives. And I mean, do you have any experience recently of clients where the archive hasn't been very important, and then all of a sudden COVID hit and the archive has become very important? Do you have any examples of that you could sort of mention as a how it's changed, the paradigm's changed from new content generation to effectively repolishing the archive?
Yeah, we've seen people, for example, that were very fans of LTO archives now talking to us and saying, realizing that the future is being able to reuse their content, and LTO was very difficult to reuse, and they are shifting their mindsets because they want to reuse old content because it's very difficult to produce new one, and they know that this is going to happen again and again. So be having the capacity to reuse, to repurpose is one of the 3 R's that we mentioned, that we think that they are very important, and to they should be principles now in the media industry. Is reuse of content. I mean, it's not efficient anymore to have content in tapes or in devices that you cannot easily access those assets that you produced in the past, because maybe you won't be able to reshoot or to produce any new content because of some other pandemic or things like that. The other is repurposing. So how do you build an archive that can be used in post, as a library, as an archive? And the last one is the remonetizing. Ultimately, the benefit of rebuilding a reusable archive and reusable infrastructure is that you can monetize your video assets that you created in the past in a better way. And it's good also for the environment to build up systems in the right way. Is good for operations teams as well to have this content easily accessible, that you can repurpose easily. So this, for us, these are like, these principles are becoming more and more relevant, especially because of the pandemic. People realized those things, how important those things are these days. Yeah.
For sure, and I come back to the two events I think of recent times that have really impacted our industry, and one was like I say, the supply chain issues over LTA tape and HD cam, a few years ago, and like I say, more recently this more direct impact of COVID, where we've had this, like you say, increase in demand, whereas a reduction ability in content. And I think you hit a point of ease. Let's define ease there. Ease in a production environment. Obviously, security is quite important within our space. As you know, we have to ensure that assets are well protected from people who try and exploit them. But at the same time, obviously, that can, by adding security, add impairment to be able to access assets. And I think a key thing about the pairing of the two technologies that we have, that we are able to work together on, is that concept of accessibility with that accountability. Obviously, one of the key things behind Object Matrix and Matrix Store is that it's more than just a filing system. There's all the metadata, there's the underlying audit trail and everything else. So it's one thing to have them online and available, but also very critically, we have that true audit trail of who's worked with the asset. Furthermore, I think the introduction of the concept of proxies. So you and I would obviously know this very familiar, but the idea of creating a viewable asset. A lot of the assets obviously we work with within the media industry is very heavy, very large, and that can make it difficult for transport, especially when we have to work remote. So being able to have technologies like Vision and Cubics and Kiosk, where we can very easily have a view into those bits of storage and be able to work with them in a bit more of a dynamic way, not knowing where we're going to be located is key. So I think that point about easy is right. And there's those who, again, clients we've spoken to over the years, who have physical archives. So this is on tape or LTO or hard drive, but offline, like you say, inaccessible, very difficult to work with. That those who had digitized before these major events had hit were able to very quickly go into the archive. And I think probably the biggest impact, I reckon, was sports. Would you say sports was an area that was quite badly impacted?
Oh, yeah.
If you think, very quickly, all of a sudden we had no live events, no live matches. So that ability to quickly go into the archive and show the classics or put things out that are relevant to the news today is very key. So I think, again, that's another point about when it comes to measuring, it's measuring not only your KPIs and capabilities today, but it's measuring that capability of flex. What if I can't do this anymore? What if I can't access that storage anymore? What if I can't access that physical archive anymore? And that ability to genuinely measure your capability to handle change, I think is a key thing that, again, media businesses need to be a little bit more open and honest about, just because I think, again, we have a naivety that the way we work is the way we work and it will always stay that way. As we've seen, it's not. The rapid amount of change that we have is happening. So I think just our next question, I know we were going to look at here, Francisco, we were talking about how the media businesses which have had the intimate relationship with consumers, how they plan for sudden and unexpected. Well, I think we've said there that there's quite a few key things about really measurement, like you say, the three R's you're looking at, and sort of reuse. But also, I think then if we start looking about how to design and use this point of inflection for going forward, and particularly what are the principles around protection, response, and growth. I think we'll start with protection. I think resilience is key. As you've already said, keeping an asset in physical form in a singular location is just not a practical way to go. And I think what I'd like to say at this point, anybody who's watching who thinks that what Francisco and I are talking about today is limited to the likes of Netflix or production companies in Soho and other media hubs around the world, it's very much not. I mean, it's fair to say, Francisco, a lot of the clients you work with are, say, banks or large corporates who have this media challenge and or responsibility to maintain their historical so if I'm a legacy company like a large bank who's been running 100 years or something, I may have media assets which represent my heritage. That's the word. There we go. And so I think, another key thing to bear in mind is whilst we talk about these challenges of media, they absolutely exist outside of the media and entertainment vertical. More and more now, we all have mobile phones that can shoot 4K. We're all generating content, but at some point, we all have that responsibility to try and protect and preserve. So I think there's a lot of lessons that anybody watching today who is not part of our media space can really take away and learn from those of us who have, learned the hard way. When it comes to protection and response. So protection and response, as we've already said, we must have the assets secure, resilient, but not in a physical way, because that response, that ability to react to change, is where accessibility, so the ability to view and interact with the asset, request the asset, is key. And I think nice pairing, a good example of that, Francisco. I mean, do you want to talk around the PFR, partial file restore, that nice, quite a simple workflow, but really sort of generates one of the key benefits, I think, of the protection and response. So, I mean, from a protection perspective, using matrix store, do you want to talk a little bit about how am I safe if I put an asset on a NAS and I put an asset on a matrix store? When it comes to protection, what are the key differences in that approach?
Well, we have different levels of protection. Protection at the level of the hardware, levels of redundancy that we add. Not just on a single chassis, but on multiple chassis. So we combine multiple servers together. So we have higher levels of redundancy than a NAS system, for instance. But also at the software level, we use checksums constantly to verify that the data hasn't been corrupted in any way by accident, by users, applications, or the hardware. And this is constant authentication, permissions, that's very important for us as well. It's security in general, because we come from the background of banks and insurance companies from the past. So there were lots of features that are in our products from day one because of our heritage, but which these days are very important in the media space. At the beginning, they were not so important. People were looking at us, oh, do I need this? But today, because everything is critical to know that nothing has changed when it shouldn't have. And that's very important in the home media supply. So we take part of, we help the whole chain. For example, you can talk to our systems and get the checksum and verify that in the other parts of the chain that the checksum was the same. So we, apart from the integrity that we provide with our system, we can also help to other systems like yourselves to get some information about those assets and verify that the assets are fine in the whole chain. Yeah.
So yeah, and again, then if we then take that security and auditing you have, and then Vision provides a portal, if you will, into that world. And it's the nice thing I find about Vision is, of course, I'm not working with the assets. I'm working with a view onto the assets. So from a security perspective, no one has access directly to the storage, of course. And critically, again, you have that audit trail and ability to react. So when it comes to change and being able to react, I can use Vision, obviously, if I'm sat right next to the storage, but I could also use Vision from a remote location. And of course, technologies like Vision and just with Kiosk, it also allows us to separate the thought of on-prem and cloud. And this is, again, it's a key thing right now. We have a lot of clients who have invested in facilities because whether it be studios, like we had obviously the introduction from our dear friends there at the start, or it be Dolby Atmos suites or whatever it may be, there's often still a need in part in the supply chain to have a physical presence, normally for an operational reason. But it doesn't necessarily mean then that we have to have everything there. Parts of the supply chain now, like we say, through use of proxies, remote access, the ability to orchestrate, can be a bit more abstracted away from the actual physical building. And so I think this changes the idea now of, well, I don't necessarily need clouds because, as we've said, cloud can be difficult to work with. You're also dependent upon connectivity. There's concerns over your power usage. It's not always the most efficient place, and especially if you have an invested infrastructure for reuse. As we've said, if you've already invested in these data center things, there can be obviously an impact to try and move away from those. But I think there's this key thing to understand, that just because I have my Atmos suite doesn't mean I have to have everything else there anymore. And that ability to remote access and work with the storage, from home, with that auditing trial, with that security, allows that change to occur.
Yeah, and that's one of the good things that we provide working together, is this level of transparency and hybrid. We can combine both worlds, the on-premise, the cloud, but with a level of transparency that the user doesn't need to know where things are. They want to use in an easy way and in a secure way the assets that they have.
Yeah, and I think you got right there that not always operators make the best decision. I think we can most politely say, and I think by taking that away from the person at the time, I believe in the good old the phrase, no decision is perfect. Any decision is made with the information available at the time, and an operator deciding what to do with this asset, the best way to complete that asset, doesn't necessarily have that wider set of information. So by having systems that is able to step back in part and help do that decision-making process for them, like you say, remove and abstract them from where things are and what's happening, we get that, again, efficiency, that orchestration, that control that we have over the global piece.
Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think that was truly insightful and a lot of exchanges there. I just wanted to sort of pose this question to both of you, and perhaps in towards a larger scope. Sustainability in broadcasting and media, can it really be achieved? Because while, as you have discussed, it is true that the broadcasting and media industry has its fair share of environmental impact, the question is, on a larger scale, can we come together to make a difference? So perhaps firstly, we can discuss, can sustainability in broadcasting and media, can it be achieved? Is it possible?
I think, just if I don't mind, Francisco, I'll start now. And I think absolutely it can. What it requires is it to be a priority within the industry. Today, whilst it's not something that you go to these trade shows and we always talk about the quickest, the latest, the fastest, I'm never seeing as much the greenest. I mean, it's there, but it's not forefront. And I think consumer decision making will drive that as we go forward, and quite rightly so. But I think it's about manufacturers coming together and reducing waste and repetition, and having, as we've talked about today, a supply chain will go through multiple different companies. It will go through multiple different processes and will go across multiple different boundaries. And if you had transparency on the entire supply chain and you could connect it in a way where it was reactive and aware of what had happened before, what needs to happen post, then yes, absolutely, decisions can be made consciously that in turn would allow for sustainability to be achieved. Whilst we continue to work in a very siloed approach, where I'm going to hand this asset to you guys, then you're going to hand it off to Francisco, and there's no knowledge of what happened before or after, then of course, even with the best will in the world, we are limited as to what we can achieve. The technologies we have now, that as Francisco has talked about in detail, that the amount of data we can store, given the energy consumption, the ease of which we can produce content and distribute it, we really have very few excuses left now as to why we shouldn't be able to introduce sustainability. But it has to be a concerted effort, and unfortunately, I find in our industry that's whilst the consumer doesn't see it as a priority, whilst I don't see on Netflix what is the carbon footprint for watching this asset, that isn't going to be something that's going to happen and change.
Right.
No,
Now,
yeah, I agree with you, James. It's and also, I mean, making systems software centric as we both do, that's also is helping, and maybe, as you say, it has to be in the mindset of everybody, not just one part, because we can do our effort. For example, we make our software in a way so you can reuse hardware. We don't force you to throw the old hardware with the new one every time we make a new version. This is something that we did because we found it was good to do, but that nobody was saying, oh, this is really the way to go, or we didn't agree with
Exactly.
anybody, our own initiative. So, but I think it should be more a common initiative, a common mindset to think about these things, yeah, in the industry.
Right. Looking at this holistically as well, the media industry is just like any industries, right? We have technological advancements, and as we see with other aspects, prices are being driven down through advancements,
Yep.
through a competition, and so forth. So that means it's no different in where we're coming right now, right? You mentioned about the difficulty that we're all working in silos, but wouldn't
Yep.
competition force everyone to come together for mutual survival potentially?
No, absolutely, and I think there's been a lot of that. What I see is wastage. So, for example, right now, if you were to walk around London, or I'm sure Kuala Lumpur, or anywhere right now, the city centre, it's much quieter than a year ago. And
Yep.
and actually, we had clients who may have 6 or 8 buildings across Soho, who are now collapsing down to 2 or 3. And part of that is like you say, is competition. The current dynamic has changed the environment as such that, by I mean the commercial environment, that that sort of what's the word I'm looking for? That complacency and presumption that there'll always be this supply chain, there'll always be this work, has eviscerated very quickly, and that's allowed them to sort of rethink. So I think right now, and this is what I'm hoping, that the good part of what will come out of COVID is exactly that you said there, that the need to react, whereas it was something that we could have done, now we have to. And I just hope that people can make the right decisions at this point when it comes to their environmental impacts, because as mentioned, if you have transparency, I mean, right now we're talking from different locations around the world, but we have no idea. I hope I'm doing a green choice today by doing this, but we don't know. I don't have that information. And I think, again, if that supply chain has that transparency, if that information can be exchanged, then yeah, absolutely, through competition and people doing the right thing, being rewarded for doing the right thing. And I think that's a key point here, is that the system has to reward those who take the right decisions when it comes to sustainability. That, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're a global industry. It's very interesting. We're quite niche. We go to trade shows and we'll see people, Francisco and I will know people from around the world. It's the most ubiquitous. Every country has TV, every country has the internet, every country has media, but actually there's a finite amount of people who do work in it in the core. And so it's not that difficult. It's not like you're trying to make every taxi driver in the world drive an electric car. That will happen over time. We have a smaller community who could absolutely take on this challenge and make a key difference to the billions of viewers globally, and how that works. But again, it's a commercially led industry. So whilst there aren't penalties, whilst there aren't encouragements in the industry to make the environment be first, unfortunately, I think it'll always be lagging behind.
Yeah.
Nicely answered, James. Um, nice to see you guys here. And I want to ask you about the fact that now that everybody's into sustainability, and there's a huge e-waste in the broadcast industry, and we find that from the from the DG betas, from all the decks that are out there, and it's just going into into the landfills. What are your solutions? Especially with Media Store, and even for you, James, with Otana. What are your solutions to the consumers out there, to the broadcasters? To the media houses who are actually using systems like yours. How do we approach, and how do you tell them that you're greener than the rest, and how do you overcome this e-waste situation that's
Sure.
being carried out over the years?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Frasco, do you want to start on the efficiency, and I'll handle the e-waste one?
Yep.
Yeah, well, on the efficiency, we can show how, because we can show figures. We'd be measuring our systems and how much energy they were consuming. So we can show figures of how how we improved over time in the consumption of energy per terabyte,
Right.
for instance. Also on the reuse of the hardware, we also we always make the effort to make our software compatible with all their systems, so on. So these things are always visible. We always present them to the people we talk to when they, at any moment. So.
And I think from our point of view, I mean, reuse again, we're one of the few. As you know, Louis, when we come in, we interact with a lot of equipment in a supply chain. And a lot of vendors will insist upon installing new hardware because that's their tested spec. That's what they know. You know, our approach is very different. I mean, for example, coming back to our post-production environment, our clients often have 100, 150 edit suites across Soho. Many buildings. So that's a big investment from a hardware perspective, but also it's a big investment from an environmental perspective. There's a lot of equipment that has been manufactured and generated to use that. So instead of asking them to deploy new hardware, which we're going to manage directly and that we are going to be confident on, we're more than happy to consume and reuse that existing equipment to not only provide them a commercial case for it, but obviously the natural environmental impact. And other things, just like in our industry, we still have a lot of paper printed unnecessarily. And we try and avoid, we talk about the vendor gap. If I have a workflow and there's a gap between vendor A and vendor B, which may not have been envisaged during the deployment of the initial workflow, but that inefficiency will absolutely create, a carbon footprint, an energy footprint, say e-waste, because people are having to work around the solution rather than with it. And so we like to remove those inefficiencies, and that naturally helps reduce, whether it be paper
That's right.
printing or, like you say, use of consumables. When it comes to tape, it may surprise a lot of the viewers who are watching. As you know, there's a lot of broadcast
Exactly.
tape still left in this world.
Exactly.
For those who are old enough, we had VHS and we had Betacam, and everybody Betamax. Sorry, everybody thought Betamax died. It really didn't. It went off Pro, became Betacam, and half of the world, if not more, video content has been stored on that ever since. And we still very much actively today are performing digitization workflows where we are migrating that media off physical tape onto platforms such as Object Matrix and others, and all the points we talked about around accessibility. But then there's the problem of landfill, like you say. What do we do with those physical assets? So at Altana, one of our companies in the group is called Spot and Spin Media Services. We provide digitization, and we are very keen to avoid all landfill where possible. So we actually have a very well proven process of recycling each of the different elements of the tape and the different types of plastic. We work with partners in territory to ensure that, to ensure the reuse. And I think logically, some of it goes back into Lego bricks or coffee tables, whatever it may be. But again, that's not something that we were mandated or often even asked to do. It's just something that, like San Francisco said earlier, that's just, as a company, we believe in being responsible and green and trying to introduce that change. And I think it's a shame that such actions like that, which obviously at the moment incur us a higher cost footprint, don't get more recognition within the industry as being what we should be doing. And I only hope I come back to my point of, how consumers can so lead the world. Given that convergence now between the production company and the home consuming it, you absolutely can drive this change. A consumer can completely now begin to affect this whole supply chain, and in choosing that. So I do hope that we will see more of that as time moves forward. And part of that is about, it comes back to this naivety. I turn on the power switch, I have power. I don't think about the nuclear power station, the distribution lines, the all of that supply chain which goes into that for me. And unfortunately, whilst it's hidden away, the same is true for media. Now, I'm not expecting everybody to go learn about everything about our supply chains, but I think just that, don't assume. The biggest thing we've learned about COVID, the thing we've learned about, environmental, is things change. Don't assume. Ask, learn, understand, and be responsible. And I think for me, that's what I'd like to see in the media industry, is that at some point the consumer's going to wake up and go and hold you accountable. And if you're not ready, you're going to lose and you're going to caught out.
That's true. And Francisco, what do you say about that?
Yeah, no, James is right. I also see this, that there is a lack of visibility to consumers of the footprint of what they are consuming. It's not like, for example, I would like to see the equivalent we have in the supermarkets here in the UK is very easy to. You go to the supermarket, you go to an area, you can see a product that is ecological, and you can see well labels, and you it costs a bit more, but you are completely aware of oh, this is costing more, but why? And there is no such a visibility at the moment in the media industry. Consumers don't see any difference between uh, assets or consumables or products that
Yeah.
have been produced in different ways. That's
Yeah,
so.
and there's a lot of cloud-based solutions these days as well, isn't it? And just to avoid the hardware, the physical hardware kind of thing,
Yeah.
as in on-premise solution, and we can have on cloud, those kind of things. And I presume both your solutions has similar, options for on cloud based for the consumers, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
indeed.
completely. We can run
Yeah.
from a case perspective, run on-prem on the cloud or a true hybrid, and it comes again back to that reusability. We're not forcing the client to choose A or B. We can put the right elements in the cloud, the right points locally. And yeah, our pairing of the two technologies, the way we work with Matrix Store and Vision, again, it's a very efficient part. And again, whilst Object Matrix is absolutely a storage provider, it still very natively works with cloud storage. But we put the right assets in the right place and we use it in that very efficient way from an energy and consumption perspective.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Okay, great. That sounds great. Gentlemen, thank you very much for today. It's been truly an honor, to have both of you on our show today, and we are just about to wrap up the whole conference, and this one of the last sessions. And I'll pass you back to Jesse and Raj, and they'll take it from there. Thank you. I'll catch up with you all soon.
All right.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much, James and Francisco. It's very insightful to know that even in the media industry, there's so much going on in terms of advancing the greener message, right, Jesse?
Absolutely, greener broadcasting. I'm
Mhm.
so glad we touched this topic and to hear from both of you experts in this area as well. And here's hoping that we can further carry on the theme that we have today of being sustainable in our environments, in our community, in anything that we do, to have that, as a priority